Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Cameron Bailey. I'm the artistic director and co-head here at TIFF, and it is my great pleasure to welcome back to Toronto Haile Gerima to present his film SANKOFA, and with an introduction to the film by Professor Aboubakar Sanogo. We always like to begin everything we do at TIFF by acknowledging where we are, the land that we're on. This is the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and Huron-Wendat. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work in this community, and if you are here for a Haile Gerima film, you know the importance of land and the people who have lived on it and taken care of it. And he's a filmmaker, I think, who really represents the best in terms of understanding the strong and deep and ongoing questions that we have to ask in terms of how land is occupied in different parts of the world. We want to acknowledge all of the people who help make everything we do at TIFF possible, including the event tonight, beginning with our lead sponsor, Bell, our major sponsors, RBC, L'Oreal Paris, and Visa, and the support we get from public bodies, including Ontario Creates, the province of Ontario, and the Canada Council for the Arts federally. Thanks as well to Classic FM Radio and Zoomer Radio, who sponsor the TIFF Cinematheque programs. We are a charitable organization, so we want to thank all of the individuals, donors, members, maybe some of you here this evening for making our year-round programming, educational, and community outreach initiatives possible. And finally, thank you to the UCLA Film and Television Archive for providing us with the 35mm collection print of SANKOFA that you will be seeing tonight. They've been great partners of ours over the years. This film is part of a series called Resistance and Revolution, the Cinema of Haile Gerima, and it's a co-presentation between TIFF and three esteemed partners, the Power Plant Contemporary Art Gallery, and we have its director, Gaetan Verna here, the Art Gallery of Ontario, and Hot Docs. The 5-film mini-retrospective celebrates this remarkable filmmaker and complements two of the Power Plant's Winter 2019 exhibitions. If you haven't had a chance to see those already, please make sure to check those out as well. We will be screening next week on Thursday, April 18th, another of Haile Gerima's films, Teza, that time with an introduction by filmmaker and producer Alison Duke. And if you want more information on that event or anything else that's a part of this series, please go online to our website, tiff.net/Haile Gerima. Haile has his own webpage, which we're happy about. Maybe we can just keep that up all the time. That would be a nice thing to do. And you can find more information about all 5 of those screenings in the series and the Power Plant's exhibitions at thepowerplant.org. And now I would like to welcome to the stage Josh Human, Curator of Education and Public Programs at the Power Plant Contemporary Art Gallery, to say a few words before we begin. Josh?
Well, good evening, everyone. The Power Plant extends our sincere thanks to TIFF, of course, for being one of our esteemed partners in this series, to the TD Ready commitment for supporting the Power Plant's entire Winter 2019 season, which includes this series of films by Haile Gerima, as well as our TD Curator of Education and Outreach Fellow position, which is a 2-year opportunity for a recent graduate interested in museum education to gain real-world experience. Haile Gerima will be joining us for a Q&A following the screening. But to introduce the film this evening, we're very pleased to have Aboubakar Sanogo here with us. To introduce Aboubakar, he received his MA and PhD from the USC School of Cinematic Arts in Los Angeles. He is cross-appointed with the Institute of African Studies, the Institute for Comparative Studies in Literature, Art, and Culture, and the Curatorial Studies program at Carleton University, where he is currently the graduate supervisor of the Film Studies program. So please welcome Aboubakar Sanogo.
Right. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today in order to honor a person I would refer to as one of the statesmen of African and Afro-diasporic cinema. I'd first like to thank Kendra Campbell, who extended an invitation to me to make this presentation. We've never met before, actually. We just met today, a few minutes ago. But it looked like she felt that I had a word or a thought or two to share about Haile Gerima and his work, in particular SANKOFA. I hope she was not wrong. I would also like to thank more globally the Power Plant for organizing this mini retrospective on Haile Gerima and screening his films across town. I hope that this is but the first gesture toward a complete rediscovery of the entirety of his work. Hopefully TIFF will take the baton, I think, after that and really show us everything that's possible that Haile has produced since he started making films. And I would finally like to thank TIFF for, of course, offering a home in Toronto for African cinema. To thank Cameron Bailey in particular, who over the past, I would say even 3 decades, has made this place a home for African cinema. Again, from Planet Africa to my own involvement since the 2000s. Where, of course, I've been returning to present some of the most important film figures in our cinema. First Semben, then Medhondo, then a bit on Idrissa Ouedraogo, and today on Haile Gerima. May I just add that I wish to take the opportunity to have just a moment of silence, because the last time I came here was, at least in a major way, with Medhondo here. Just a moment of silence so we can remember the passing of this major film figure who passed away on March 2. 2019, so barely a month and a week ago. Thank you very much. It's an intense privilege to present Haile Gerima today. So they gave me 5 minutes. I will, if you don't mind, I'll take the liberty to go a little beyond because I traveled 400 kilometers. So 400 kilometers for 5 minutes is a bit tough for a teacher. So, it gives me an intense privilege to present Haile Gerima today. It's in fact the 3rd time that I'm presenting him to an audience. Twice in 1998 at the Smithsonian Institution in DC when I was myself a curator there. In 1998, I created a program called Great African Films of the 90s. In fact, there's a distribution company that took the title and made it now part of their label in New York. Without crediting, that's okay. So I remember presenting SANKOFA very clearly. There's a reason why I'm giving you the anecdote at the Hirshhorn Museum, and we had a very long and intense Q&A with Haile. With the other room was really packed. And I was surprised the day after the screening to receive a call from my director. I was working at the National Museum of African Art in Washington, D.C. So she called me. She said she received a phone call from the office of the secretary of the Smithsonian. I never actually shared this story with Haile because he actually was very, very hesitant to come. I felt that his voice had to be heard also at the Smithsonian, and so I insisted, and he graciously accepted to come. So somebody had called the secretary of the Smithsonian to complain about this session. They felt that the taxpayers' money should not be going to sponsor an event like this. And so my boss calls me to ask me for explanation. I said, well, listen, as far as I'm concerned, Haile simply exposed the vile face and corrosive ontology of racism and reminded us all that the Smithsonian itself, along with many of the buildings of the National Mall, were built by the real-life slaves embodied by the characters in SANKOFA. I'm not sure. So I argue, therefore, that if the Smithsonian cannot deal with its own history, I'm not sure exactly why it exists. Indeed, to use a phrase that's now very common in Ghana, the Smithsonian itself might need to sankofate. Hence the need, therefore, for Haile's presence. And of course, that was the end of the conversation. I would like, therefore, for this brief discussion to really share with you what, not really introduce the film as such, but really share with you what I consider some of the resonances of both Haile's work and SANKOFA in general. So very, very, very briefly. So I mentioned, of course, Ousmane Sembène and Medhondo earlier because I wanted to place Haile Gerima also in affiliation within African cinema. His link with the Los Angeles Rebellion have been amply documented, as you know so well, through retrospective, books, and articles. Of course, there are links with the new American cinema, Latin American cinema, etc. But I will simply say that as far as Africa, I would simply add that when you think of movements, whether intellectual, artistic, cinematic in our case, they often come embodied around three figures. If you think of Marxism, you think of Marx, of Engels, of Lenin. You think of negritude, you think of Leopold Sedar Senghor, Aimé Césaire, and Gontran Damas. But in African cinema, I would argue that we have three statesmen and what you can consider the archonts of African cinema, of the integrity of its critical tradition. And they are, in my opinion, in order of appearance, Ousmane Sembène, Medhondo, and Haile Gerima, each coming a decade after the other. So one born in the 20s, another in the 30s, and another in the 40s. Each on their own, and together, I think, they embody the ethos of the artists as the critical conscience of their people, with a shared responsibility to create a dignified image of the African and Afro-diasporic subject, and thus partake in their subjectivation. Now, beyond these features, of course, one may wonder whether these three filmmakers actually also speak to each other through their films. And so I was struck, in fact, when I rewatched Hourglass and rewatched also SANKOFA, by the ways in which such was the case. If you think of, for example, the quest for self of the suitcase-carrying protagonist of Hourglass under the watchful eyes, voice, and ideas of Malcolm X, Fanon, and others, in fact, this is reminiscent, in my opinion, with the suitcase-carrying protagonist of Soleil O, who also has the same mentors in some ways. Think of the scene in SANKOFA where Shola, which you'll see very soon, entered the slave dungeon to find herself in a case of co-presence with slaves of the past, or from the past. In other words, in the context of an abolition of the border between the past and the present. I think it resonates also in many ways with Medhondo's West Indies, in which migrants who are living for Paris encounter slaves walking in the opposite direction, literally in a case of spatial co-presence of the temporal categories of the past and the present. Likewise, if you look at the flogging sequences of SANKOFA, one can help but think of their revisitation in the context of female circumcision by Ousmane Sembène in Molade. I don't know if you recall the epic scene where Kole Ardo is publicly flogged by her husband, who wants to her to renounce the Molade. So I've coined the term agoraphilic to refer to moments in the films of Sembène where contradictions in narrative work themselves out and in a very public way, and place and in a context of public confrontation under the watchful eyes of antagonists on both sides of the contradiction. In that sense, I would argue that aspects of SANKOFA partake very much in the concept of the agoraphilic, which already applies to the films of Sembène. Two other sets of resonances is what I call the ambulatory mode, also something through which I would like to think of also to think of the cinema of Haile. I'd like to propose that umbrella. So I've referred to it as the ambulatory mode. It's a mode of filmmaking that is found in the articulation of in the continental/diasporic dialectic in Afro-diasporic cinema, the one in which some African and Afro-diasporic film artists succeed in creatively inhabiting and rendering the complexities of the affects, of the experience, of the modes of being on both the African continent and in the diaspora. In other words, these artists and filmmakers inhabit and claim both homes and both as homes. So to them, each leg or side of the Atlantic Triangle is the site of positive creative possibilities, inspiration, and actualization. They work not in squares or in circles, but in triangles, as it were. Naturally, of course, they have predecessors in the figures of Fanon, Césaire, and others. But in the Afro-diasporic cinema, the following names come to mind. I'm thinking of course, Haile Gerima, Hourglass, Harvest, Bush Mama, SANKOFA, Teza. I'm thinking of Medhondo, Soleil O, West Indies, Sarawunia, Lumiere Noir, and Watani. I'm thinking of John Akomfra, we think of Testament, Hansworth, Who Needs the Heart, Seven Songs, The Last Angel of History, The March, and others. Raoul Peck, when you think of Men on the Shore, The Tulu Mumba, Sometimes in April, Moloch Tropical, etc. So the ambulatory mode, I think, is not flannery. These filmmakers are not Afro-diasporic flaneurs. Rather, they consider each other of the triangle as both constitutive and co-productive or shared individual and collective identities. Now to SANKOFA, very quickly. I think that SANKOFA, in many ways, to me, may be read as a metaphor for the archive. We were talking about the archive earlier. For the archival. I think the first, of course, is that the archive, be inside SANKOFA, that the idea that the archive is a condition or possibility of self and common reconstruction. It seems to be an ultimate technology of permanent identity production. It takes a multiplicity of forms in the film. The archive is first conceived as a place, so the slave dungeon, for example. Indeed, a place can be silent. A place can be a silent archival space that needs to be spoken in order to reveal its infinite potential of regeneration of the human. In the walls of the castle lie archives of pain, of wailing, of wandering souls, of displacement, of human barbarity against the human, of the passing of barbaric acts for acts of culture and civilization. The slave castle almost becomes another technology, something like a portal into other spaces, other archives of oppression, of dehumanization, of trauma. For example, the plantation. So in that sense, I think that Haile succeeds brilliantly in making felt the suffocating and claustrophobic conditions of slavery in open air very palpable and feelable. He gives visual and sonic form to the archive as narrative and to narrative as archive as well, which I would argue is the ultimately indestructible archive even under the effect of a potential nuclear annihilation of the species. The other archival sites are actualized in the film. Trees become sites of archive, ritual, gathering spaces, colors, symbols, songs, chants, all almost become archival chants. Therefore, moving our definition of the archive beyond, of course, the scriptural to include all these other spaces. Finally, I would say that SANKOFA, to me, is really an ultimate text of the decolonial. In other words, the film does not simply seek to offer an imagined rendition of the conditions of oppression under which bodies were owned, bought, sold, branded, raped, and turned into merchandise, but the film is also very much invested in the decolonial project, insofar as it seeks to sanction the humanity of the brutally enslaved through the impossible audacities of their imaginations and imaginary, through their knowledges and know-hows. The film makes clear that no amount of oppression or willful attempt at destruction will ever triumph over the rebellious and indocile, creative and imaginary resources of the human. SANKOFA, I think, is thus a site of the polysemic. So instruments of debasement become instruments of liberation. The machete that cuts the cane also, that perpetuates submissiveness, also chops the bodies of the perpetrators. Other knowledge sites are equally validated. One, for example, of which I'd finish, and I think we were discussing that yesterday, is the question of the status of the Maroons, for example. What does it mean for knowledge, for our way of thinking, that Maroons exist in the first place? Have we seriously looked at what it means for them to delink in the way they did, to create their own societal models? What other modes of sociality may they have made available to us? What does it mean to live outside? And what other epistemologies may be at play here? Finally, I'd like to finish with a quote with a figure that Haile likes a lot. It's a younger figure, but I think whom he really respects a lot. I'm thinking of the late Thomas Sankara. In February 1985, Kaidi cinema author and journalist at the French daily Libération, Serge Danet, whom many of you hopefully have heard of, traveled to Ouagadougou, to FESPACO in 1985, in Burkina Faso, to interview the late Thomas Sankara, who was a cinephile, a Pan-Africanist president, etc. So Serge Danet asked Sankara what he thought, what in his opinion was missing in African cinema. What did he feel that in 1985 did not exist sufficiently in African cinema? And this is his response. Sankara said, well, I think that dignity has not been sufficiently represented. I think that the cry of the heart, the justness, the nobility, the necessity of the struggle in Africa have not been sufficiently represented in African cinema. Sometimes one gets the impression that Africans agitate themselves for no reason in a mean-spirited world. What we have lived, what we have suffered, what we are currently living through, what we are currently suffering from, we have not sufficiently trumpeted it. in my opinion, he might as well have been speaking about the cinema of Haile Gerima and indeed of our film tonight. So enjoy the film and enjoy the conversation with the filmmaker and Cameron Bailey. Thank you very much.
Haile Gerima. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Haile, I'm going to ask you just a few questions, and then I want to open it up to this audience. You know, revisiting the film, it struck me that it's becoming more valuable, more urgent than ever with each passing year. And I think partly that's because there are so few films, there's such little representation of the African experience of slavery on screen. Even when you made your film, I mean, there was very little at the time. There was, you know, these exploitation films in the 70s. There was Roots, the TV series. And after SANKOFA, even then, there's been very little, 12 Years a Slave and one or two others. So when you were setting out to make SANKOFA, knowing that there was just such a dearth of images on screen at all, people just weren't telling those stories on screen, what was most important to you to put on screen in terms of that experience?
Well, thank you. Thank you for surviving the film. Is it working? Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, I think with all its imperfection in the film, I think it's the struggle of overcoming or trying to overcome as much as I could the narrative domination of this Eurocentric, especially in cinema, of how story is conceived, how story is plotted, and how story is structured and paced. That was the early with all Charles Burnell, Larry Clark, and most of the African-American filmmakers and Native American filmmakers who were there at the same time with us. Our issue was not only the content of how black folks were depicted, but this, now I'm more coherent. I couldn't say this coherent then, but it's this narrative logic that I think the Eurocentric power that exists, especially in cinema, specifically in cinema, it just tells you how to start a film, how to credit a film, how to close a film, etc. And you lose a lot of this different idea of thought system that actually comes from your acculturation, where you come from, etc. So basically, for me, I think because of the economic situation, we didn't have the money we needed. When we hit Jamaica, we had only $167,000 to do a period piece. And for me, there are a lot of things that had to drop. You know, if you just take, for example, the relationship of the plantation power over the African enslaved population, most white people in Jamaica dropped out of the project. Although they were excited to be in a movie, but they all retreated saying, this is too African.
They didn't want to be in that movie.
Yeah, yeah. So there was only 3 white folks committed left. I had, part of my research was this power, especially if you look at South Carolina and even North Carolina, Virginia, the power of containing the enslaved population gets lost. It becomes like, even when we ourselves make a film, if slavery was not cruel, we were okay, kind of idea. But the cruelty is a byproduct of something else. And so to sustain that was a struggle. Anyway, I don't know if I'm answering your question. I wouldn't.
You are. I want to go back to what you said at the beginning of your answer in terms of it wasn't just the content of the story that was important to you to get up on screen, but it was the form, how you told the story, and maybe some things that were typical in Hollywood storytelling, 3-act structure, protagonist, antagonist, those kinds of things that you were going away from. what do you see as the real changes that you made in terms of how you told this story here in SANKOFA?
Well, remember, it's an imperfect achievement. Basically, for example, I was against this whole John Wayne archetype of storytelling, meaning it's always the principal character. And if you notice, I'm shying away from the audience identifying with one. But it's really a character development I was working, because I felt African societies are communal. Even the way they build their houses is very communal and circular, etc. So out of that, I felt African characters, there is no John Wayne in African characters. It's a community.
There shouldn't be a single protagonist.
Yeah. So for me, the women, for example, I can line them up for you with the women characters, how they're connected, passing a baton of certain characterizations into the next episode. So I was very much interested in this and succeeded to some extent and failed also. And it has a lot to do with resources of how to sustain. For example, if you didn't have a certain equipment you hope to have, that could also have implicit impact on the project. The other thing is Africans, for me, my struggle in America since I came to Chicago and then to Los Angeles, my struggle with Americans, even with African Americans who actually resurrected to make me be militant, I've always clashed in form. And I always asked, why am I clashing in form? And my script writing teachers and me, this is the struggle we had to wage. And to a point, I had to completely not even be in classroom, but have a separate private classrooms, because there was a teacher who recognized the battle was in my thought system, the way I organize my imagination. And the Western domination always, especially in film, tells you how to begin and end. And I remember in the hallways of UCLA, we used to say, we don't need no popcorn. We don't need no credits in the beginning. All these things. It's part of this imperfect rebellion to find something that was bothering us. And so for me, the form is always the problem, because I've always felt, why is it so many good people in America would watch a film about an oppressed young girl in the coal mines of some Ireland or Scotland, and then still go back after the theater, after the movie, go to wine and dine. I had that cultural problem. I could not imagine them eating after that. But then I said, maybe the story is passive, not aggressively disrupting the way of life of comfortable people. And I used to tell Larry Clark, I want my film to haunt the audience all the way to their bedroom. I don't want them. But it's not easy to get it. But this part of the kind of frustration, because I don't want to be an entertainer. I never wanted to entertain oppressive people in oppressive relationship, because I felt I would be part of the situation.
That's interesting. A number of people have made the connection between your films, less so with other films in terms of form, because you're actually rebelling against that in many cases, but with certain kinds of music, with jazz music in particular, with the kind of the disruption of patterns, traditional European music patterns that we found in jazz from 50s onward, but maybe even before that. Did you find a kind of a connection, a resonance with, say, African American music that was going on then?
Oh my goodness, especially jazz. Especially jazz. Even now, I'm doing a film called The Maroons of the United States, and it's basically now I've been looking for, Baraka was what I was hoping to get maroonage in jazz, because I was very upset with the way Ken Burns took the tooth out of jazz and made it, some kind of appropriated music at best. So for me, I knew I was finding in my research this amazing, not only in this Senegambian Congo, Louisiana, which comes also from Haiti at a certain historical moment, but when it surfaced into Congo Square it was coming from underground to above ground. And I was looking for a historian who could get jazz as a marronage. It was an underground music. And this I have clues. And just recently a book came out, and Sidney Bichette actually says the Maroons began jazz.
Oh.
Yeah. So I'm now about to go to
interesting.
Louisiana. I thought I was finished shooting. This is a film I've been doing for 20 years. So I'm about to go now to shoot, because this is now finally there's official academicians going into. But for me, when I saw Haitians, Senegambians, Congo meet in Cuba and Louisiana, you see it. You see something was there because it was part of the rebellion soundtrack. And so the other part of it, I think you're asking, is the very beginning of jazz. For a long time, white Americans were repulsed the way the sound mixer at UCLA was repulsed the way I use sound. He said, I cringe the way you sound, Haile Gerima, he said to me. But jazz musicians used to be coon music. It was dismissed music because the African aspect of it was not easily palatable. It's later on that white America, negotiated the appreciation of jazz. In fact, I was presenting a speech at a university, and I don't know how many of you know about the noise ordinance. Is now a big struggle in America, in the black community. The part of us gentrification, whites are now demanding black people don't make noise. And so my speech was they would have killed Coltrane had they been in his neighborhood. Now they are like the ambassadors of Coltrane, but if they were where he was practicing, even in bathrooms, they would have called the police on him. So to me, I think the African was battling in music. The African was battling in food. You look at Brazilian food, you look at the Caribbean food, you look at Cuban food. Africa insists to exist in all circumstances. So the resistance is not just one way of like political resistance, but it was a lot more. And I think especially in music, black people, Africa is there, but it's transformed in its experience in the new circumstances of the Americas.
You mentioned resistance. It seems like there's a kind of a formal resistance in the way that you approach film technology and film form, storytelling form, in the way that, say, both maybe John and Alice Coltrane would have done in terms of traditional European music forms as well. Mm-hmm. And there's always that thought when those things are first introduced that people are doing it wrong, right? You're playing the instrument wrong. Yeah. But it's actually a new language that's being created.
Transforming whatever it's grabbed, giving it that transformed African aesthetics. Mm-hmm. And the other part of it is also, especially in cinema, I guess very tragic because when we go into film school with all its white supremacist vocabulary begins to dominate our faculty of imagination. So the source where you source cinema, which is close to dream, is the imaginative faculty. When they tamper with us, discouraging the imagination. This is our experience. Every black film student, Native American film student, Chicano film students. This was the whole very battle in the beginning was our imagination was illogical. And therefore, we have to learn from classic films how to tell. Then when we take it there, it loses its initial aesthetic form. And this, I think, is like more and more, for me, even now, although many black people are tired of fighting, tired of trying to assert their aesthetics, their culture, in the future will be very, very prominent.
Given all of that, how did audiences respond to SANKOFA when you first showed it to them? Were they able to recognize what you were doing with the film?
Oh my goodness. I learned more. I saw where I was also to have to be a student from, especially in Harlem and a few other places in North Carolina. The audience started teaching me. I left teaching for 2 years just to see how interacting with audiences about the film.
What were they teaching you?
Well, they were teaching me, for example, let's just look at in the structure in a specific scene, I did this this thing, what I call butt cutting. And the butt cutting, literally the audience were disrupted. When I cut that cut, which usually sometimes is film school problem, when I did that, the audience went this way and I was going, and then they caught me again. And it is in rhythm and pacing. This is what I learned. My pacing was losing the audience. The other part of it is for example, I took for granted that black people knew Catholicism, for example, because I was working with that Catholic culture and slavery, and Louisiana was really what I had in mind. But African Americans are primarily Presbyterians. So they kept thinking Joe is the son of the priest here. And if in Catholics in Louisiana, in black people, Maroons in Oklahoma and Texas, they knew what I was doing here. And I'm also Catholic, not a practicing Catholic, but that's why I'm harping in that kind of in that religious landscape.
Interesting. One of the things I've seen develop in the last, 20, almost 30 years coming up, like 27 years, I think, since SANKOFA was released, is that audiences, critics, scholars are very attentive to something called trauma in cinema. That wasn't something that was a word that was used at the time, but you put your audience through a lot of very tough scenes, scenarios, and in fact, what she goes through, what Shola goes through, is itself traumatic for a reason. That's on the way to something else. But now there's a lot more thought about what that does to audiences and viewers when they're watching things that they may identify with that will just take them to a place that's very traumatic for them. As you watch the film now and as you show it to audiences, how does it work on people in terms of the trauma that it's showing and what it might actually elicit in some of the viewers?
Well, I'll tell you, the first time it opened in Washington, a sister walked at Howard in my office, and she kept saying, I had stepped in those paths. My feet has been there. And when I first came initially, my encounter with African Americans were very confusing because I was not, I didn't even know they came from Africa. And that's part of why I began to make movies, to really reacclimate myself to understand who are these folks, because they were also my very base. They were the people who embraced me. Even though I'm making a film on the Ethiopian-Italian War, they still send me money to help me make a movie on the Ethiopian-Italian War. So, but at the same time, I was amazed how there are certain things that are discouraged, not only in music, although it's big in music, that their African, their memory of Africa is always stomped out, discouraged. In physical terms, when you look at, for example, You're Not From Africa is a decapitating point that helps to subdue an enslaved population. And the fight against it is also to insist I'm not a slave. Even in the war, the other day we were showing a film and we were saying, I think, Africans are not slaves. They're enslaved people. Even our language has to change. So the enslaved populations, in fact, for the motor of this film, it's initially, I always tell black people, you like it now, but you would have stoned me to death if you saw the first draft of my script. And I have it. And why I'm saying that is I think in terms of, for me, when I realized the brutality of slavery, see, the problem here is when you stress on the brutality of slavery, you undermine the capacity of black people in bringing about a very harsh penalty. Otherwise it's not genetically white people who go around beating people. So I wanted to know, why were they so cruel? The facts I'm getting in flogging 400 lashes, a person losing everything in their control. Why is that? And then I realized black people from day one resisted. To a point now, I'm making a film to show that from day one, black people killed white slave owners and joined with Native Americans. It's dated, it's quantified. For me, that resistance is a threatening expression. And to me, for black people, we were just minding our business and white people flogged us, don't work. And this is why I don't like many slavery movies, because to me, it doesn't go to the core of the fact that black people are saying, I'm human, I'm not slave. You take Nat Turner, for example, there's a brief moment when he's asked, why did you come, no, where were you? Your master is a good guy. Your master likes you. He's different from other masters. But he said, in his eye, I'm still a slave. So he was fighting brutally the idea that is in the white man's head of him. To me, this is a very undermined, and I'm telling you, this is factual. Black people in America have made 6 people presidents, from George Washington all the way to Andrew Jackson and another guy. They've made, all of them became popular smoking out black maroons in America, fighting, killing black maroons and Native Americans who joined to fight them. Louisiana's story is African story, why they have to buy it. Florida is black African story, why they have to buy it. Monroe, Madison, the early Virginians, their obsession was slave uprising. And Gabriel Prosser uprising is the best lesson, where Madison or Monroe writes Jefferson and says, they're wanting the same thing. They want to be free. And what should I do? And Jefferson said, well, kill some of them. Now we're in power. Kill some of them, deport a few of them, and commute the others. People don't know this history. By Jefferson's idea is to this day, nobody wants, every biography they do, one of the things he said in his book on Virginia, he says, black people, he said, Africans and white people cannot coexist. One has to kill the other, which is, to me, not necessarily so. You just have to stop controlling people, and it's the end of the game.
I know that when the film was made, you were working deliberately outside of the Hollywood system, but you and Shirikiyana, your partner in the film and in your company as well, had to work hard to get this film to audiences. I remember that you took the film on a tour, you rented theaters, you found ways to get busloads of people to come and see the film. Can you talk a little bit about, even once the film is done, the work that is required with a film like this to get the film to audiences?
Well, it opened in Berlin, and many people do not know the extent of our struggle with liberal white Americans in the industry. For example, when we first was admitted in the Berlin Film Festival in competition with all those movies, we made it in a basement in Washington, D.C., low budget, and many white people called us to congratulate us. Then we go to Berlin. The day our film showed, the press is supposed to come to interview us. The American press completely boycotted us, including the independent film magazines. In fact, when I always tell people, as I came down from the airport, so many lipsticks, people kissing me, and then all those people disappeared after they saw the movie. And I said, it's like the white overseers who dropped out of my film. So I said, next thing, the press ignored us. And we came to Montreal, the American press ignored us. Toronto was the most successful screening. Most people were applauding out of the theater. I don't know if you were there.
I was there. I invited the film, man. I remember it.
Well, they were applauding, following me out, and there was a Hollywood guy saying, who are you? Who the hell are you? He would say to me. All this, even had a meeting with me and Oak Post Fallout. I don't want to go there. But they all ignored us. And when we went to the black community in Washington and we said, okay, I said, I'm going to pay what I owe teaching, because this film was for me exorcism. And we called black people in the room and at the Kennedy Center, rented, and said, if you believe this film is important, you show it. We made it. It's not, you can't sit around always, have filmmakers cook for you film. So I walked out. But Sharik stayed and they created this thing called the SANKOFA family. That's when it like the line in Washington, D.C. is hard to believe. People were coming from Arkansas. They were coming from Detroit saying a black film usually opens and disappears, so they want to catch it. But we recruited them to organize SANKOFA family to take us. And so for me, people do not know the extent the industry goes. Seriously. For example, they evicted us out of a theater in Los Angeles. We entered into, once we became successful, the New York Times, the Washington, now we are renting theaters to show our films with United Artists. Next thing, they evicted us. And we asked the vice president who was talking to me all along, we were going to have wine in New York, etc. He says, why are you evicting us? He said, my theater manager checked into a hospital. And I said, what has that got to do with us, our film? We're doing better than all these other films you're doing this outfit. But he said, the SANKOFA tension. For the first time, 2 people on the line, I have witnessed hearing the SANKOFA tension. And I said to him, does Die Hard Next Door have tension? Many black people go to Die Hard to see Die Hard movie. And he says, I'm not joking.
What is the SANKOFA tension?
The SANKOFA tension is that the film is really tense. And it's making white employees very,
uncomfortable.
Yeah, and they evicted us with police, fire trucks, etc. And it was a big incident. It was in the newspapers in LA Weekly, etc. But to me, what I'm saying here is, I think that's when I realized in Berlin, oh, okay, so it's like if the film, you give it feedback, whatever criticism you have is one thing, but to be scared of a movie is a tragedy. And so I don't know if that tells you, but for me, that taught me a lesson. Now, but the other thing is, if Hollywood people came to Sharik and me, in fact, one time somebody comes, we were sitting, somebody wants to bring money, but they want to see the script. And we said, no. Sharik and me didn't even conspire. Both of us would say, no. This is the way we respond to the industry, because they always feel if he bites, he comes, is the idea. So we said to the brother, you, the producer, we don't want white people to judge black script. That's crime. It's a crime for a white person to judge a black family story and say it's a good movie should to be made, to greenlight it. And that is another acceptance. So if there's not a black committee I can go to, I wouldn't trust white committee at all. And this is not like racism. It is my experience of what I have seen, how much they have done in Hollywood in transforming stories that started somewhere else going into another place. Case after case is visible. Now, there are black people also. The other part of it is I would have a heart attack if a white person begins to tell me what to do. I don't even allow a black person tell me what to do. So for me, it's not acceptable in culture. It might be even in cooking. If I'm cooking Ethiopian food, I don't want nobody American coming to tell me about my Ethiopian food cooking. They just have to eat it and say it's bad or good. That's the thing they have. So basically it falls into that. And to me, and Sharika and me, I'm always pragmatic. People think they call us impossible, but we're saying the script cannot be approved by you. You got to take a risk. We do it because we believe we have to do it. That's how SANKOFA, we believed in it. Mm-hmm. Therefore, black people put it in the world map of distribution.
Mm-hmm. All right. We're going to go to you now, and your questions for Haile. I don't know if we have Yes, we do have microphones on both sides of the room. So if you got a question, please put up your hand, and we'll get a microphone to you. There's someone back here.
Me?
All the way in the back.
I see a hand right here.
Hey,
but
there's me.
I can't see it. Can you wave?
I'll get up.
Where are you? Thank you. Okay.
Hello. All right. So you mentioned the Ethiopianness in a little bit, and that's where my question is going to come. bear with me. The question will come out, but like I'm trying to make it the most clear that I can.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I know that you were born in Ethiopia and then came into the States for your education and stuff like that. And my question is, did you get any backlash, or did you have any people come up to you when it came to telling the story of, telling a story of the Black diaspora and the transatlantic slave trade, but again, having that Ethiopian background that doesn't have the real connection to that? Do you kind of get the question that I'm saying? And this question is kind of inspired by my own studies. I've basically studied the transatlantic slave trade in university, but I've always had feelings of what am I doing in this field because I come from an Ethiopian background. I know that connection did come in post-revolutionary studies, and there's like hundreds of years of back and forth with Ethiopia and the Black diaspora, and that in a post-revolutionary, revolutionary sense. But my question is the beginning question. Mm-hmm. Hopefully it makes sense.
Well, my relationship with Black people is a constant struggle in America. First, I was this colonized, Peace Corps educated, colonized, hyphenated American with no basis arriving into Chicago. It's the Black Revolution that completely embraced, literally rehabilitated me out of that to even look at Ethiopia, where I came from, with all its virtues. And that's the diaspora story, by the way. So for me, initially, and also I don't really ask permission from nobody. Nobody. I get inspired to write a poetry. I'm not going to listen to a fascist who says, why do you write a poetry? But you inspired, you write, It could be on gender. A whole lot of fascism women could say, you can't write on women. I said, the hell with you. I'm going to write, and you'll outgrow, you will die. There's other women and men who will come in the planet. They might see it objectively differently. So for me, you don't have to ask nobody for nothing, but you have to be truthful to yourself that you're not lecturing people, or you're saying, I know you more than you know, etc. To me, African Americans have offered Africa the biggest. We Africans, in fact, the best we could do for them is be proud Africans first, and then share. And then this diaspora story is our story. You're lucky I don't come to Canada. I mean, I'm busy occupied in Oklahoma, Oklahoma. So for me, you might even it's not even only white people. Black people could be jealous of you, but you don't play that game. You come into it because you believe your intellectual intuition is what you have to trust. Right. Ethiopians have said to me, why are you telling a slave story when your country's sitting waiting for you? I said, I'll make film there too if you bring money, but I'm making film wherever I am because I don't know how long I would live where. I make film where I am. And the guy is a big intellectual Ethiopian guy. He didn't even see the relationship you're seeing. I think you should confidently write, but try also don't manufacture truth. Be always in search of truth. Truth is elusive. And to me, this is one safety I have. Truth is not like, especially living in America, Americans think truth is like mouse, you catch it with a mousetrap. That's why they're in trouble with Trump. But for me, truth is elusive. When you get to it, it's leapfrogs. When you get to it leapfrogs. The Africans here in America, in Brazil, the story is complicated. You have to be willing to grow and study.
All right, thank you. We've got, we're going to go here and then here. Go ahead.
My question is, if there are so many more black people than white people, and if they can all overthrow them, how come they didn't?
Thank you for watching my film, by the way. Thank you very, very much. Well, I don't think let me tell you, how old are you? 10, okay. Let me just go back about immigrants first to talk about this. If you notice now, everybody's monster is immigrants from Latin America, from Africa, from Middle East, Asia. When I go to Europe and I see these Europeans touch my people with gloves, okay? It's the most challenging image. And to even call them refuge itself is an insult. I live in that world. I have 6 kids I raised, and racism hurts the little kids, not the grown-ups. And that's why I'm very adamant anti-racist. I will do anything to contribute to the breakdown and, you know, elimination of racism, because it dwarfs so many nice, tender little kids, boys and girls, etc. Now, having said that, let me tell you what I told a friend of mine from Ethiopia. You know, the dialectics, this sister came from Yale, Ethiopian sister doing research about the immigration. I said to her, listen, don't blues it. I can see the blues. People see the blues of what's happening to the Middle Easterns, to the Africans, to the Latin Americans. Look what's happening in the country. They were overthrown. I mean, listen, from Arizona to Texas to Florida used to be their country. Those people trying to come in, that is their land. If you do research, thank you, sister. So for me, this is how I see it. By the way, what should be out of all this brutal situation is all these immigrants breaking boundaries, fences, climbing fences, are creating the most humanist one world of colored people. In 20, 30, 40 years from now, it's not going to be this thing, the Trump planet. It's going to be colorful people's planet. And this is the seed that we're seeing is they are voting to create the true one world, global world. This is why I told a sister, I say, don't write about the visible. Imagine what these kids whose parents are crossing boundaries. Look at this audience here. I mean, in Canada, all this is people who broke boundaries, fences to get here. And we're creating the 40, 30 years, 100 years from now, the world will be not this few folks who think their birthright is, you know, let me say this. I'll tell you, one time I was listening to this American guy being interviewed, and he was saying that, don't make me feel guilty about the starving Ethiopians. You know, if God wanted them to live better, he would have created them in America. Now, he must be like from Ireland, Poland, if he's in Chicago or somewhere, but he's so confused he doesn't know he came from somewhere. That's what we're witnessing. And so, my sister, you don't have to overcome. They will all we will color each other. We will have a colorful planet. As a young person, you will be one of the makers of that. I mean, I don't want to be Martin Luther King, but not maybe in my time.
All right, thank you. We'll go right here.
So my question is a little selfish because I'm writing a paper and I want your take on this is an idea of contradictions, and it came up in your film, and you mentioned dialectics, that practically every scene and every moment there is such fine attention to grasping the contradictions within the experiences in the moment, which would be what would create that that disruption that you were looking for. So my question is, what is your opinion on the lack of contradictions in current Black cinema? And I'm looking at films that are coming out recently. What is your opinion on that, and what does that do to the consciousness and the capacity for raising consciousness in the Black community right now?
Well, I'll tell you, I without being, you know, I mean, the so-called LA rebellion, I'll tell you one thing. One of the things I missed, and where we also failed, is the fact that we were critical students of cinema. We stopped when the group fall apart and go into different places. Initially, what you're saying was really what developed our cinema. Even all, you know, the whole you know, the way we study history, these contradictory forces. We used to debate in Chinatown after editing films, you know, what we felt, what is a shot, and how does a shot, how could it be vortexed into a next shot to be a scene or a sequence. We used to analyze like this and more. In fact, I taught at Howard University. I'm retiring now because for the past 10 years, my students have been my teachers at Howard because I go with them to eat, we argue, we fight, and that's how I was. Their script to do, what to do or what not to do, I learn in everybody's script. But now we're finding students that are completely asking me the first day of class, am I going to get A, Professor Gerima? And I said, this is the end of my teaching. Now, why I bring that up is to say to you, filmmakers are now bulldozing their way in. It is also in the way the system is opening pressure valves. Every 20 to 15 years, when white Americans are in trouble in America, they open the valves and create a whole mediocrity cultural expressions emerge. And that's how even the black exploitation movies emerged. So for me, it's a period of black exploitation film we're going, in my view, because of what you were just saying. It lacked, the scripts are not going, like, let me tell you, I worked on a person's film that is out now because people think I doctor the script, etc. And I said, it needs 10 drafts. But the guy, and the next thing, I'm invited to a screening. I felt it needed 10 more work, you know, to streamline the narrative because it was all over the place. So in America now, with all this new technologies coming in, streamline like Netflix, etc., they are uncooked filmmakers are becoming filmmakers, unripe filmmakers are becoming filmmakers. Not a well-developed script is becoming a movie. That's what we are. But it's a moment, in my view. I've seen it before. It goes through this kind of situations. For me, if you want Africans, especially Native Americans, people who claim they have been shortchanged in the white supremacist narrative as doormats or as driving Miss Daisiers, we then have to really say, we should stop saying it's my turn to make a movie. And white people should sit down and no, if it's your turn to make a movie, what alternative work are you bringing? If not, let white people make the movie. For me, it's as clear as that. If you are going to, however imperfect, if you're going to empower a story without compromising it to appease 25 husbands, okay, then it will be a very interesting film, even if it's not perfect all the way. What I'm seeing now is even white, for example, black cinematographers have been bringing this thing we've been working on. Black people cannot be just, wrongly exposed. In fact, that's why Larry Clark in Passing Through started using Fuji. We felt Asians are near to us. They calibrate the film for Asians. Therefore, let's try Asian film. And abandoned Eastman Kodak. Some of us did only, like Harvest. I could have shot it in color, but I didn't want to because I was not in charge of the colorization of the film. So, you have to respect the very people you claim they're oppressed. Their story, if you say my story is compromised, then you have to be vigilant to restore your story. But do not go into a room and say, while you're imagining the story, I want to appease, I don't want to alienate white people. That's stupid. White people are stronger than that. The second part is, you can't even say, I want to appease black people and write a good script. You can't. You have to write and let the chips fall where they have, including for you to also make mistakes and learn from your mistakes. So for me, the absence of pedagogical, critical discussion is it's not only filmmakers. It's across America. The students, and I think it is the way this digital imperialism is possessing people's spirit and soul that is affecting the intellectual production.
Thank you. We are out of time, but if you're willing, I would like to invite one more question from the audience.
With pleasure.
All right.
I'll stay here all night. That's dinner.
All right. Well, we can't go all night, but we can do at least one more. Who's got a question? Back here? Okay, go ahead.
Hi. You mentioned earlier, and I hope I'm getting this right, that you don't consider yourself an entertainer first in discussing the structure of your story. I heard an interview with Steve McQueen, who made 12 Years a Slave, where he described himself as an entertainer first. And obviously we've seen movies by other filmmakers, for example, Quentin Tarantino, where he tells difficult stories using the characteristics of entertainment in a more conventional sense. I was wondering what you thought about telling difficult stories by using the more popcorn Hollywood characteristics of entertainment versus what maybe you do.
Well, first, I really don't know. At one point, a filmmaker in Hollywood, a black filmmaker who respects me, I asked him for to come through for this film, and he sent me a note which I have still. It's not entertaining, and I told him, how can the Holocaust be entertaining? And that's where we stopped. So for me, you can't be divided about this. I think, to me, fame, you want fame, go for it. Don't vacillate. Go for it the way Beyonce does it. But to me, it's like this. You can't, if you want to tell a story first, you cannot create difficult stories versus non-difficult stories. There are untold stories, my brother. And they have to be told for the world to balance itself, because stories exercise the bad aspect of social relationship. Even, for example, white people live on a planet spoiled. They think they're the beginning and end, those who does. And I know those who don't also. But in majority, if we look at the Trump's followers, all this oppressed white people now, because black people are getting what? Unemployment? Like, I don't know where they come from. But for me, it's very important to know that white people are spoiled because they're not facing reality as the world is. Because to me, let's live together comes where we really realize you're heading in the wrong direction. But if Native Americans, my brother, don't tell stories. When I went to film school, I went with Native Americans. There were women and men. And when I was in Berlin, I told the white filmmakers, I don't identify with you, I'm sorry. I'm not an independent filmmaker with you. But where are the Native Americans who dared to want to be a filmmaker? Where did they disappear? The Chicanos, the black folks. So for me, I think the Native American story is a healing story for everybody. If you go to Vancouver and you see this white man's name in a spiritual land, or a statue in South Africa, tearing a mountain, spiritual mountain, like a Wagnerian architecture, and you have nothing to say about the spirit of the Xhosa people, you continue to spoil people who are spoiled, who could bring disaster. Spoiled people are dangerous. What do you think Hitler's followers are? Spoiled people. Unrealistically fantasizing about something that's not from Earth. So for me, I see it in the United States. White people in general, who are the reactionary ones, are spoiled. They really don't know. For my kids, I say to them, listen, before you break your breakfast, there was a Native American in this land. An Ethiopian father came from somewhere. And there's a spirit here. Even Ethiopians, we come from this land. We should understand we're in a land of spiritually contented land. And the harmony is to realize it, not to guilt trip on it. But the other part of it is all people have to tell their story. It shouldn't be only white people telling stories. Look what we have come to. I think the world wants to hear, especially this Canadian Native Americans, natives in Latin America. When this film Roma was showing, it was like, for me, it was like driving Miss Daisy in Spanish. Okay? Seriously, however much you love it, it's about this woman, like that black woman I saw many times, who doesn't have origin. She's only breathing and dying in the context of those white peoples. And I know Mexico very well because black people's history is erupting. I've been filming it. So it's very important to tell this. I want to know, not those white people. I've seen them in many Latin American writers. The wife, her problem, her children, the kid wants to be film and whatever artist. We've seen them in Cuban films, in Argentinian films, in Bolivian films, in Argentinian films. What I haven't seen is, it was glimpsed during the Cinema Nova movement. And I don't know how many of you knew Sanjinas, for example, the Bolivian filmmaker, The Blood of the Condor. The Blood of the Condor, every white American who went to Peace Corps should watch it. Canadians should watch it because it's a point of view from some angle. So for me, it's very important to know that we want to know the person who's cooking your food. I don't care how much you love her. You know how many Italians come to me in Venice when my film was winning Teza, I was there. These Italians are coming. They say, we want to make a film with you. And I said, good, bring the money. And they said, but the story is about this woman who was a servant of my father in Asmara. And I said, excuse me, who told you I make films like, I call it Miss Daisy all over again. Italians asking me, there's 5 proposals that came to me after Venice to make a film about the white person. For example, they want me to make a film about this. He says, we want you to make a film about Menelik, dramatic films. I said, good. And I said, okay. And then he says to me, Anatori is this Italian guy from a ruling class who came to Ethiopia, who started the conflict of Adwa. And I said to him, that's not the story. That guy is a 1-minute story. The story is Queen Taito and Menelik, their love story, because I was fascinated how they vowed to remarry each other again. How she put the earring on him after the Adwa battle. That fascinates me more. And look at what the Italian wants me to do. And I'm telling you, there's not a day I don't get proposal, but it's all about white people being the central, and the appendages, the chairs and the lamppost and the cooking kitchen people, utensils. And this is not acceptable now. I know white people who just know it. There's, in fact, a film, The White Savior. How many have seen short film this comedian made called White Savior? I force you to see it today in YouTube. The most insightful film about race cinema by white filmmakers. Because they know what's going on. They know what we're compromising.
Haile Gerima, thank you for SANKOFA, for over 40 years of disruption from then to tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you, my brother, for always being there for us. Okay, and I have to tell you in front of everybody, he had showed my wife's film and she had sent, how are you, how's the family? You heard me in public.
Thank you.